Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everyone. I'm Sheldon Ingram inside Pittsburgh, and thank you for joining us. We want to look back at some of the stories that were big in 1999 and tell you what's going to shape up for those stories in the year 2000. And joining me are my colleagues in the Action News newsroom, Nina Pineda, Jim Parsons, and Paul Van Osdol. Thank you very much for joining us. And all of you guys had a hand in some of the big stories that we covered, and we want to kick them around just a little bit to find out what you learned in some of these stories and what's going to happen in 2000. A lot of open-ended questions. And let's look at the rundown of some of the stories that we're going to look at, starting with, I guess, myself. And we'll be dealing with the DUI piece that I did and what this state is going to do to toughen its DUI laws. And Nina was really involved in the impeachment process of President Clinton. We're going to look at the outcome and how that's going to affect the elections in 2000. And then Paul and Jim, they're going to focus on the row offices that really caught a lot of people's attention last year. And we're going to find out what's going to happen as a result of that. And I guess we'll start with you two guys. And what did we learn about these row offices, and what was the gist of these stories here? And I guess these guys were just ripping off taxpayers as far as time was concerned. Am I right?
I guess, Sheldon, when you look at the row office system, it goes back to 16th century England. The way it was set up here made sense maybe at a certain time, but there are a lot of people now who feel that the time for row offices has passed. And what we found to be interesting was that the row officers themselves say that their jobs are archaic, their offices are antiquated, that they ought to be merged, but hey, as long as they exist, they're going to continue to not show up at work or do a private job like in their law office during the day, or go to law school, which we found one of them doing during the day.
Let's define the row offices, if you will. Sure. Paul?
Row offices, Sheldon, basically these are courthouse positions. These are people who work downtown in the courthouse, and in many states what you have is one clerk of courts, usually an elected official, who's responsible for the administrative functions of the court system, making sure people can file lawsuits and can get marriage licenses and that sort of thing. What you have here in Pennsylvania, every county has 5 or 6 different elected offices essentially performing that clerical function, clerk of courts. So you have your pathonetary, which is basically responsible for civil court filings like lawsuits, civil lawsuits. You have an elected clerk of courts who handles the criminal side of the courthouse. You have a register of wills. You have a register of deeds, or a recorder of deeds. And so you have all these different offices which essentially are clerical in nature, and in many states they are basically one office. And that's one of the reasons that there's been so much attention on row offices and whether we really need them, because they're basically overlapping duties.
Overlapping duties, and the folks who were handling these positions, you guys found out that they weren't really on the job.
Well, they don't answer to anybody because they're all elected positions. It's not like the county commissioners or now the county executive would appoint a bunch of row officers. They're all elected positions, and so they can get away with, in the case of Jean Milko, what we found, and she's one of 2 elected jury commissioners. There's a Democratic jury commissioner and a Republican. She has been for about 25 years now the elected Democratic jury commissioner. And essentially what we found is she doesn't show up at the office. Rarely is she in the office. We found that out by surveillance, by watching her. We found that out through some court documents. We found that out through talking with employees in her office who went on camera with us and said, this woman's never here.
Given what you said, that it's an antiquated form of government, can you blame these people for not showing up all the time?
Well, you really, I mean, they justify in their own minds the fact that they don't need to show up because, and we heard them say, in fact, they all pretty much use the same excuse. They're on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if they're not in the office all the time, well, that doesn't really matter because they answer to the voters, and in their minds their offices are functioning efficiently, and so they don't have to be there all the time.
What Jean Milko said to me was, I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about how to make that office better. Yeah, what are you supposed to say to that? I mean, how are you supposed to argue with that? I mean, if that's the way she sees, and some of these other row officers see their job as basically, hey, they're elected, and if they don't show, if they show up once a month or once or twice a month, that's fine, and no one's outraged by that, then why shouldn't they get away with it?
Let's run an excerpt of one of your stories here, and then I guess we'll start with this either Paul or Jim, but let's take a look real quick at an excerpt from one of your stories when you approach these guys about their row offices.
You've probably heard of Cyril Wecht, who lost last week's county executive race, but you may not have heard of his son David. He's the county's elected Register of Wills. There he is, walking into his private law office to start the day at 8:50. At 12:25, he heads over to his elected office at the city-county building. On the way, he stops to pick up a newspaper. Then he chats with District Attorney Steven Zappella before going to work. But he's not there long. At 2:30, he leaves the city-county building and heads back to his law office, where he spends the rest of the day. A couple weeks later, we see a similar pattern. Wecht drives his county car to the private law office in the morning. At 11 o'clock, he leaves, but he doesn't show up at the city-county building until 1:30. We tried to talk to Wecht, but he did not return our calls, and he was not available when we tried to see him at his county office. We caught up with him as he started another workday at his private office. Can you tell me why you've been working as little as 2 hours at your other office? Why as little as 2 hours, David? Can you tell me why you're spending so much time over here and not at your other office? Why as little as 2 hours at the other office, David? Later, Wecht faxed us.
Refuse to answer your question.
Obviously.
I feel uncomfortable sitting next to these two. Because you know that they've earned the enmity of a lot of people that they have covered, a lot of people that you followed around to show how they were not doing what they've been paid to do. And I think they have resented the fact that they've been under surveillance. But a lot of people on doing stories that I've been out doing stories, people have mentioned to us that it's time for these political payback positions to be done. Here we are struggling to try and pay the bills of the county. And some of these things, which are sweetheart deals, people supported other people in campaigns and they get these positions. Didn't you find that that's historically what these row offices have been, just political paybacks?
Yeah, the elected positions themselves, of course, can't be political paybacks because these people have to get elected. But a lot of the employees in these row offices, yeah, a lot of them are friends or relatives, and it has been historically for a long, long time. Although what the row officers themselves say is that they have all cut back on their staff tremendously over the past 5 to 10 years.
And frankly, a lot of them have been forced to because the county commissioners have not given them the budget increases they've wanted. And just a point to add on this David Wecht story, we obviously tried many times to try to talk to him about why he was working this second job at his family law firm, and of course he refused to talk to us, refused to respond to us.
What does that tell you? I mean, on one hand, these people say that they can only spend so many hours a day working on these row office jobs. They have staff taking care of everything. But then on the other hand, you have David Wecht. He refuses to answer any of the questions.
Well, Sheldon, I think the larger story here is about the system, like we were saying before. The fact that you can afford to spend most of your time, or half your time even, at a private job, just indicates that the system does not require you to be there. And keep in mind, these positions are essentially, these guys are administrators. They're running an office. In most places, other than Pennsylvania, their jobs would be filled by people with administrative training and essentially bureaucrats.
Let me get your opinion on this. Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania rather, this region is looked upon as an antiquated region. It's provincial. It's 20 years behind the rest of the country. It's not a progressive region. And yet we have an archaic form of government that we're getting ready to move away from. But do you think, what kind of changes do you think should be made in regards to county government to make it more efficient, other than having a county executive and a 15-member council?
Well, I think if you look at, as Paul said earlier, if you look at some other regions of the country, you find that a lot of, when you're talking about specifically row offices, you find that a lot of these duties are performed under one clerk of courts, who is in charge of what is done in 4 or 5 of these row offices. As a matter of fact, it's not just outside of Pennsylvania. Other counties have, under Home Rule Charter, other counties in Pennsylvania, Erie is one of them, have consolidated these row offices. Erie did it 20 years ago. We went up there. We talked to the county executive. And they have found that it is much more efficient to have it that way than to have it this way. And they're surprised that it still exists this way. Now, we may start moving away from row offices in 2003. There is, under the new Home Rule Charter, an option for moving away from row offices, but it'll take a referendum, and the actual moving away from row offices may not happen until 2007. So.
Give you some insight.
Yeah.
This whole region is adverse towards consolidation. You have a zillion teeny boroughs that can barely afford a police department.
135 in Allegheny County.
Exactly, but yet they don't want to merge and try to consolidate to save money. So, and the other thing is a power structure. A lot of these people don't want to give up the power to be able to hire their own friends in some of these row office spots. So that's going to be interesting to see how this referendum deal plays out in a little bit. When we come back, we're going to look at the impeachment process and how that will play an impact on the upcoming elections and the state's new DUI laws for 2000. That ahead. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Nina Pineda joins us after spending time in Washington early in the year doing the impeachment process. What did you learn from that situation?
Oh, Sheldon, it was just such a crazy time to be in Washington, especially after talking to so many people here in Pittsburgh about what they thought about the process of what was happening between Monica Lewinsky and the president. You know that people really polarize on each end. There's so much cynicism about politicians. And we really found as we went down there, we talked to both of our senators and all of our local representatives in Congress. And instead of posturing and instead of them kind of paying us lip service about how they felt, I really saw that they felt passionately this was one of the biggest decisions that they will have made in their political careers, whether or not to impeach the President of the United States. And there were other things going on. We were going to war the day we were down there. We were interviewing Representative Mascara, and we were interviewing Senator Santorum and Senator Specter. And they, at the same time where they were talking about whether or not we should go to war, they were studying these articles of impeachment, trying to figure out if the president lied about having sexual relations with this White House intern. And then we would come back here and talk to people at diners. You were talking to people, remember, in barbershops, and getting the real pulse of how the American people felt about this. And it was amazing to me to see how they would really stack up on each end. Some people really felt passionately, of course he should be impeached. He lied under oath. And so many people said he had an affair. Why should he be impeached? And to try and balance that, plus to go down to the White House and go down to the Capitol and cover the stories, was really just an amazing time to be a journalist covering. You'll never cover that again. Hopefully we'll never have to cover the kind of thing that we were doing at the time, the impeachment of a president.
How do you think this will play out in future elections? I guess primarily with this presidential election.
Yeah, we're looking at, I think that people were really disgusted that we were that involved as journalists in the personal lives of politicians. I was glad we didn't see it with Roddy and Wecht in the county executive election. Nobody delved into their personal lives. Should we be there? Or shouldn't we? Should we be looking at that? I mean, is that something you guys want to investigate?
Hey, you know, I'll tell you something, Nina. If we get a tip on a political candidate who's running for the top office in the land, whether that's county executive or president, and the tip has something to do with moral character, absolutely, we're going to look into it. Now, does that mean that's necessarily news? We make that decision along with our managers when we find out what it is we're talking about. But I think we always look into that.
And I think there's a real fine line about whether or not is this something that is news? Is this something that's important? Moral character is definitely important to the president that we elect, and it should be to the politicians that represent us. But I think when you ask people, do they think that we should be looking into this, there is a really fine line.
Absolutely.
And there is no hard and fast rules.
Keep this in mind. Keep this in mind that a lot of the allegations that occurred with President Clinton occurred right there in the White House.
Oval Office.
In the Oval Office. So that makes some fair game, whether these matters are true or not. In my opinion, it makes some fair game because all of these allegations happened within the confines of his position as president.
So should we be looking at what George W. Bush did 20 years ago? He is the front runner as the Republican candidate. Are they going to? And there are teams of researchers in Texas right now, paid for by the Democratic Party, trying to dig up some dirt on George W. Bush to tarnish his image. Now, I don't know if they'll get anything that exciting for Vice President Gore. I mean, he seems squeaky clean, but they're definitely looking.
It's absolutely relevant if one of the questions that Bush has continued to duck is, have you ever used cocaine? He does not answer that question, and I think it's an absolutely relevant question.
I think it is, and it's also what's always more interesting to me is not so much the dirt, if you want to call it that, that's unearthed on some of these candidates. It's how they respond, and how they respond, I think, tells more about the candidates than what they actually did in a lot of cases, and that's something that's always interesting. But to echo what Jim was saying, I mean, certainly, even though there was a lot of public reaction against the media for what happened with Clinton and Lewinsky, that's certainly not going to deter us from looking into allegations. Now, there's always going to be a lot of review and a lot of careful consideration before we air any of this material.
My position is that I look at some of these matters and I try to determine how much it will affect that person's role in office. So when you look at someone's past history, how pertinent is that issue to what they're doing today and what they will do 4 years from now? If Al Gore or George W. Bush did drugs 20, 25 years ago, are they still actively using that drug recreationally? If you speak, and how will that affect them today or 2 years from now? There is a line that you said that should be drawn. And I think with Clinton, he was fair game because all of the allegations took place within the confines of the White House. However, you go back 20, 25 years, I think very serious skepticism has to be drawn as to whether or not that's even pertinent to what's going to happen with these guys today.
I agree, and I wonder if we're going to start eliminating what would be the best candidate for any position, any local position, the mayor, the county representatives. If we're going to start eliminating the best people for the job because there's been dirt dredged up from their past, and some of it is irrelevant, but some of it is very relevant. So we'll have to see. I don't know if people want to see us dragging Senator McCain or Bill Bradley through the mud as we go forward with this next election. But I think that there was lessons learned and backlash learned from how much information was too much information, especially what we learned with the Monica and President Clinton scandal.
Well, you brought up a very interesting point in that it really depends on how these guys respond to some of these questions, because I'm of the mind that none of us are perfect, and all of us have skeletons in our closet. All of us live by trial and error. We make mistakes, whether it's drinking, drugs, or, I don't know, infidelity, what have you. But many of us have made those mistakes, and it depends on how you answer those questions. And I think a lot of the American people can identify with you if you come across as a natural American rather than a pious figure.
And when you look at some of these people who've admitted to past wrongdoings, I mean, usually that story goes away within a day or two.
Exactly.
It's when they try to cover things up, and certainly that's a pattern you saw with Clinton. I mean, he had a pattern that was established from the time he was very young of evasions, of maybe lying, and those are the things that
gives us
surfaced in
ammunition. I mean, the more evasive you are, the more ammunition we have to load up on you and come back at you the next time. Let's talk about the state's new DUI laws, and this is a story that I worked on just a couple of months ago. Let's take a look at some of the video we have. And basically, you're looking at this guy we caught driving the wrong way on the Parkway East. He was actually headed towards downtown in the eastbound lanes. And then we stayed with him. We called the cops. They caught up to him, and you see this guy failing a sobriety test. You know, the only reason why he didn't fall is because he's holding on to his car. Basically, what the state wants to do is possibly lower the blood alcohol level from 0.10 to 0.08. And really what that would do is that would require fewer beers to have you declare it legally drunk. That's one of the laws that they're pondering. You think that's the answer in keeping drunk drivers off the road?
0.08 is, what is 0.08 for the average person as far as build? They said that's something like, for a 150-pound guy, that's 2 beers
that might be
in
2
a half
beers.
hour or something
Well, for
like
you,
that.
it's a sniff of a bottle of
Right,
vanilla.
exactly. Exactly. But I mean, I think, of course, we all chuckled as we looked at that video because it's funny to see somebody kind of stumbling around like that. But, you know, it was the middle of the afternoon. He was going the wrong way down a ramp. You happen to be there with the cameraman and get it on film. How many times do we not do that? If he wasn't stopped, you had to call the police.
Yeah.
Could he have gone down, maybe slammed into somebody, killed somebody, killed a child?
There are a lot of repeat offenders in Pennsylvania.
And I think your story showed that that's the real problem here. The real problem, the real answer may not be with lowering the blood alcohol content, although that is certainly one solution. But when they can't even control the people who have had 3, 4, 5 DUI convictions and are still getting behind the wheel of a car, and as we talk, you know, New Year's Eve is the night before, how many repeat DUI offenders are out there last night driving around?
I mean, these guys, they're not only caught 5 or 6 times, those are the times they were caught drinking and driving. There are other times where they were not caught, so you're talking about, God knows, 25, 50, 100 times that they're driving while intoxicated. The other thing is this breathalyzer, the ignition device, interlock device, where you breathe into it, and if you have alcohol in your breath, your car will not start up. And they're going to make this mandatory by law that repeat offenders have these placed on their cars to prevent them from driving. And most people say that, even the drunk drivers that I talk to say that that's probably the most sure-proof way to keep them off the roads when they're drunk.
Although, frankly, I think there's always going to be loopholes, even when you have technology like that. There's going to be people, if they really want to get behind the wheel, they're going to figure out somebody else to start the car for them, or, you know, there's going to be a way for them to get behind the wheel. But there's clearly a weakness in the laws when, as we've been talking, you have people with multiple DUIs who are able to get behind the wheel, and nothing seems to happen to them.
Right now, Pennsylvania has some of the softest laws in the country, and by, I guess, February or March, they plan on having some of the toughest to cut down on the repeat offenders. I want to thank you 3 for joining us. Nina Pineda, Jim Parsons, and Paul Van Osdol. Thank you very much for joining us. Up next is Wendy Bell, our consumer reporter. Stay with us. Report. reporter at Channel 4, joins me now to talk about one of the more interesting stories we should be paying attention to in the year 2000. Thanks a lot for joining us.
You bet.
Listen, advanced fee loans.
Yes.
This is the big story that you worked on last year.
Absolutely.
That we should be paying attention to. What is this all about?
It's something that is very easy to fall for, which is the problem. What happens is you read in even reputable publications, from Reader's Digest to the classified section in the newspaper to magazines that you would normally go out and get, and there are ads, very small ads for money, and they sound great. Free cash or, you know, free loan. You don't have to pay anything for it, and it's there's a toll-free number listed. You phone the toll-free number. They ask you about your credit history, and it could be horrible. And you usually, the people who need these loans usually have some kind of credit past that's not good. You give them the information, and boom, in an hour, you qualify for upwards of $25,000 worth of loans. The catch is that you need to send in some money, which they call a processing fee. You send in a check to this P.O. box somewhere. They pocket the cash, and you never see your loan. And it's going on all over the country.
How much money do they require of you for this processing fee?
Often several $100s, $200, $250 at the very least, up to $560, $580 was the guy. We got a phone call from a local man here in Pittsburgh who said, "This sounds really weird."
Where are these companies located?
Oh, that's the catch. They have a post office box perhaps in New York, maybe in Connecticut, and yet all of the money is then sent to Canada. They're setting up shop in Canada. We saw this in the late 80s in Florida. A lot of these advance fee loan brokers set up shop, like almost sweatshops in Florida, and then you never see your money again.
They basically get a hold of everyone's credit report.
They don't even look at your credit report.
How do they know to
They're
call
not
you?
even creditors.
How do they know to call you?
You call them. You call the toll-free number because you need money.
Where do people see this toll-free number? How does
In these ads. These
in
ads. Reader's Digest, People Magazine.
Oh, so they
in the
don't...
back of the Post Gazette. They're everywhere. We could go to a magazine stand right now, and I could pull 4 or 5 of these publications
Is
off
the government going to
shelves.
crack down on these?
They're trying. They're trying. But now what we're talking about is that these advance fee loan brokers, as they're called, have set up shop across the border in Canada, and that makes it difficult to prosecute them. So we're actually, our FBI is working with their Canadian Mounted Police to try to track these people down, and they're doing a good job, but every time they shut down one of these scam rings, 10 more open in their spot. And they're targeting people in elderly communities. Allegheny County, second oldest county in the United States. This is happening all over Allegheny County.
What form of the government in the United States is really looking at this? The FBI, is it the Commerce
FBI.
Department as well?
It's just what I understand, it's the FBI. This is a big thing that the Canadian Mounted Police and the FBI are working together because they've moved out of the United States, across the border, up into Quebec and other places, Toronto, Montreal. And they've set up shop, and if you could see these places that they're operating out of, no bigger than a glorified bathroom, almost, with little cubicles.
What's your advice to some of the consumers out there?
Always, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. It's going to be too good to be true. There's no such thing as free money out there. And when you have a troubled credit past, and you call somebody and you can't go talk to them right away, and they say, "Hey, here's $25,000, but you have to pay us up front." Run, hide, don't do it. Ever.
Wendy Bell, our consumer reporter, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
We're out of time. We'll see you again next week. Take care.